My son said, "Dad, she's the best woman I've ever met." He said it with that youthful excitement I once recognized in myself. I smiled as I watched him. I believed that after so many years of loneliness, he had finally found the one. But 2 months later, while making my bed, I saw a thin gold bracelet on the sheets. I had no idea how it got there. But from that day on, I began to notice things that sent a chill through my skin. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Walter Hayden. I was 75 years old the morning I found the bracelet. For 42 years, I worked as a tax accountant in Canton, Ohio. My days used to be numbers, patterns, and ledgers. My life was routines. The same cup of black coffee each morning, the same creak in the porch step, the same station on the radio at night. After my wife passed, the silence in the house became another kind of routine. Not comforting, not painful, just something that settled into the walls like dust. That morning, I woke earlier than usual. I always made my bed right after getting up. It was something drilled into me by my father, a Navy man who believed an unmade bed was the start of a weekday. I straightened the sheets, pulled the corners tight, and smoothed the cover with the flat of my palm. That's when I saw it. Nestled in the crease between the pillows, half tucked under the edge of the sheet, was something golden. I didn't recognize it at first. I thought maybe a lost earring or a loose piece from a picture frame. But when I picked it up, it unfurled slightly in my hand. A bracelet. Thin, delicate, made of small interlocking loops. Gold, not plated. Lightweight, but not cheap. It had a fine etching along the edge, something floral, almost antique in style. The clasp was intact. It hadn't been broken or discarded. Someone had placed it there, or dropped it, perhaps, while dressing. But not me. I hadn't had anyone in my bedroom, not in years, not since Margaret died. My son Jason visited, yes, but he had no reason to be in my room. His new girlfriend Emily had been around more lately, but again, why would she be in here? The thought made my skin pull tight against my spine. I sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding the bracelet. It was warm, warmer than it should have been. The heater hadn't been on. The room was chilly, but the bracelet held a strange, soft heat, like it had just been worn. I looked around the room, as if expecting to see someone hiding in the closet, someone who would suddenly laugh and say, "Gotcha." But I was alone. I'd been alone since the coffee brewed at 6:30, since I fed the birds in the backyard, since I folded the towel I kept by the sink just so, alone with a bracelet I couldn't explain. I walked to my dresser and opened the top drawer. It was filled with things I barely touched anymore. Old handkerchiefs, cufflinks, a watch I hadn't wound in a decade. I placed the bracelet gently on top of a folded white cloth and closed the drawer. My heart was beating in a way it hadn't in years, not in grief, not in joy, but in confusion. My body was telling me something was wrong. I went about the day as usual after that, made toast, ate half, took my pills, watered the front porch plant even though it had long since gone dry and brown. But the bracelet stayed in my mind, hovering like a shape just beyond the fog. I began to retrace everything from the past few days. When had I changed the sheets? Last Sunday. Had I seen anything then? No. Had I left the window open? No. Had someone been in the house? Not that I could prove. I started cleaning with more purpose, not to remove dust, but to notice things. I looked for fingerprints on the windowsill. I checked for disturbances in the layer of dust on the bookshelf. I began to write things down. Time of day. What I saw, what I heard, what I didn't hear. It felt absurd, like a man setting traps for ghosts, but I didn't laugh. I felt watched, not in a paranoid way, in a quiet, precise way, like someone was walking just one room behind me at all times. The bracelet wasn't expensive enough to matter, not in terms of value, but it wasn't nothing either. It was personal, intimate, a kind of jewelry someone would never loan out casually. It didn't belong in a guest room. It belonged on a wrist, close to the skin, worn during moments you want to remember. And now, it sat in my drawer, on my cloth, in my house. I sat in my armchair in the living room that evening and watched the way the sun slanted through the blinds. The dust motes danced like they were trying to spell something. I remembered the way Margaret used to clean those slats with vinegar and an old sock. I hadn't touched them since. They were just there, collecting time, like the rest of the house. Jason had said Emily was special. "The best woman I've met," he said over a Sunday breakfast not long ago. She had that kind of smile that seemed like it had been practiced in a mirror. She laughed at the right times. She complimented my coffee, even though I never changed brands. She looked around the house like she was cataloging it, but maybe that was just my imagination. I had no proof, only the bracelet. I didn't mention it when Jason called that night. We talked about the Browns game, the rising gas prices, how his back was hurting from lifting a box at work. He didn't ask how I was. He rarely did. I didn't offer much, just enough to keep the silence from creeping too far between us. When I went to bed, I opened the drawer again. The bracelet lay still. No note, no explanation, just metal and quiet. I stared at it for a long time, then turned off the light. Something had changed, not in the house, but in me. I used to explain everything. That was my job. Balance the books, follow the logic. Now I couldn't explain a single thing, and that scared me more than death ever had. I didn't sleep much that night. I woke up to the sound of the wind rattling against the window pane. It was still dark, and for a moment I thought it was the middle of the night. But the red digits on the clock blinked 5:14 a.m. I reached over to turn off the small fan I kept beside the bed, even though the air had turned cold in recent weeks. I liked the hum of it. Margaret used to say it reminded her of ocean waves. Now it reminded me that I was still alive. The sheets were twisted. The pillow was warm, but only on one side. I reached out across the mattress and felt something strange. Not a thing, but a sensation, like the outline of a presence. The fabric was indented, faintly, as if someone else had been lying there not long before me. It wasn't just the weight of memory. It felt physical. I sat up slowly, bones protesting as they did every morning. My hands rested on my knees. I looked down at the sheets. There, near the edge, was a faint smudge, barely noticeable, like the imprint of skin that had been damp. Not wet, not stained, just used, like the bed had held more than one body during the night. I made my bed methodically, as always, tucked the corners, smoothed the wrinkles, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was cleaning up after someone else, not just myself. Something about the texture of the fabric felt wrong, softer in places, warmer in others. And then there was the scent. It wasn't mine, not soap, not detergent, not the musty hint of age and old books that had settled into the house after decades. This was sweet, faintly floral, like a perfume someone might wear when they wanted to be remembered without seeming too obvious. It reminded me of department stores and dressing rooms. It did not belong in my bedroom. I went to the bathroom and washed my hands. Twice. The mirror caught my reflection, creased, hollow-eyed, unsure. I hadn't seen myself as a man who second-guessed reality, but I had begun to wonder if my mind was playing with me, or if someone else was. After breakfast, I returned to the bedroom. I ran my fingers over the pillow again, pressing into the dip where my head should have lain. I measured the way the sheets fell, the tightness of the corners, the way the comforter held a fold that curved inward. These weren't just shifts from sleep. These were imprints, patterns. The bed remembered more than I did. I opened the drawer again to check if the bracelet was still there. It was. Untouched. Silent. Cold now. Not warm, as before. I closed the drawer slowly, almost as if sealing a box of questions I wasn't ready to ask. Not out loud. Not yet. At lunchtime, I sat in the living room with a sandwich I didn't finish. My appetite had changed lately. I couldn't tell if it was age or worry. I turned on the radio for noise but kept the volume low. I listened not to the news, but to the silence in the hallway. The bedroom door was cracked open, and I caught myself glancing toward it every few minutes, waiting for a sound. A creak, a breath, a shuffle. By early afternoon, I changed the sheets, not because they needed it, but because I needed to reset something, to test a theory. I chose the blue set, plain, slightly coarser than the others. I made the bed again, crisp and square. Then I left the room untouched for hours. That evening, just before dinner, I returned. The scent was back. I bent down and pressed my face into the pillow. It was there, stronger now, not overwhelming, but undeniable. A different smell than mine, softer, powdery. My heart beat louder in my chest, not fast, but hard, like it was trying to speak in code. I changed the pillowcases again. This time I took the used ones outside, down to the basement, and sealed them in a plastic bag. I didn't know what I was doing exactly. It felt ridiculous, but I wasn't ready to call it delusion. There were too many signs. That night, I took the armchair in the living room, slept there, or tried to. My back didn't like the angle. My legs cramped up after an hour. But I wanted to see if the bedroom would change in my absence, if something would move without me there. I kept the hallway light on, a habit I thought I'd given up after Margaret passed. I used to do it for her. She didn't like walking through dark spaces. I never needed it myself, but now I found the glow comforting. In the early morning hours, I stood silently at the edge of the doorway, looking in. The bed looked undisturbed, still tight, still neat. But when I stepped closer, I saw it. The faintest dip in the sheet. A dent. Small, subtle, like someone had sat there for a moment, just long enough to leave a memory in cotton. I pulled out my old notebook from the drawer in the hallway, a brown leather journal I hadn't touched in years. I began to write. October 11th, 4:57 a.m. Imprint on right side of bed, unexplained scent, drawer unopened, bracelet status unchanged. It read like a report, like something I'd submit to a supervisor. It gave me structure, made me feel less like I was unraveling. I drew a small diagram of the mattress and marked the indentation. I felt calmer afterward, still uneasy, but anchored. That day I didn't mention anything to Jason. He called around noon, asked if I'd gotten the leaves raked yet. I told him I was thinking about it. He laughed, said autumn was making me lazy. I agreed because it was easier than explaining that my house had started whispering to me in linen and perfume. I checked the closet next. My closet. All my clothes were where they should be, but one shirt had been rehung backward. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't remember doing that. I never did that. The hanger hook pointed the wrong way. It was a small detail, barely worth noting. But I wrote it down anyway. That night I lay down again in my bed. I waited. I didn't close my eyes. I kept the light off, let the moonlight from the window sketch shadows on the wall. I listened to the wind, to the fan, to the breath of the house. At some point I drifted off, and when I woke just before dawn, the bracelet was no longer in the drawer. It was on my nightstand, neatly placed, centered, not forgotten. I didn't move. I just looked at it, and I realized the bed wasn't the only thing that remembered. The house was keeping a story I had yet to read. I used to think I knew every sound this house could make. The subtle thump of the furnace kicking on in winter, the occasional rattle in the plumbing when the temperature shifted too fast, the long, slow creak of the back porch steps when the wood expanded from heat or contracted from cold. Even the squirrels that scurried across the attic at dusk and dawn had a rhythm I recognized. But lately, the sounds had changed. It began with a tapping, not loud, not insistent, just a soft, irregular tick-tick-tick that seemed to come from inside the walls. I first heard it late one night when I couldn't sleep. I had turned off the bedside lamp and laid there in the dark, trying to slow my thoughts. That was when the tapping began. It didn't follow the usual cadence of a pipe or an animal. It paused, then continued, like fingers drumming a message in code. I sat up and strained to hear it better. It was coming from the far side of the room, near the baseboard, just beneath the old framed painting of Lake Erie that Margaret had hung back in 1981. I turned on the light and walked over, placing my ear against the cold wall. Silence. Nothing. Just the hum of the distant street lamp through the window. The next morning, I dismissed it as a dream. Perhaps my ears playing tricks on me. I was old enough to know that aging came with a certain amount of static. But the noise returned. Again at night. Again faint. But real. Soon after, I began hearing something else. A low vibration, barely perceptible. It came and went, like a whisper carried through old wood. Sometimes I thought it was the refrigerator cycling. Sometimes I thought it was something else entirely. I walked from room to room, trying to locate the source. I even pressed my palm flat against the walls, hoping to feel the echo. But the house remained still, as if mocking me. One morning, after one of those strange nights, I noticed the picture frame on the hallway wall was crooked. Only slightly, just enough to catch the corner of your eye. I straightened it without thinking. But the next day, it was crooked again. That wasn't wind. That wasn't gravity. That was something moving the wall. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't let it go. I started keeping a small notebook on the coffee table. Not a journal, just notes, times, sounds, locations. The page for October 16th had 5 entries. 3:12 a.m., soft ticking behind bedroom wall. 3:19 a.m., sudden silence. 4:03 a.m., vibration under floorboard, near closet. 6:05 a.m., creak in hallway without footsteps. 8:47 a.m., picture frame, tilted. I no longer slept through the night. I would lie awake and listen. At first it was passive. Later, it became a kind of vigil. I sat in my chair in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, coffee mug cooling on the table beside me. And I listened. The house had started speaking, and I didn't yet know the language. Sometimes the noises came in waves, a rustling followed by a creak, then silence, then a distinct knock, always 2 knocks, never 3. I checked the doors, the windows, the locks. Everything stayed shut, but the sound returned. I moved slowly through the rooms in my slippers, trying not to let the floorboards betray my weight. I turned corners with the caution of a soldier. I checked closets I hadn't opened in years. I pulled back curtains. I stared into vents. I found nothing. Once, just after midnight, I swore I heard breathing. A soft, shallow rhythm coming from the air duct near the ceiling. I turned off everything, radio, heater, even the hallway light, and stood beneath the vent, head tilted back. The noise stopped as soon as I got close. I waited for a minute, then another, then 5. Nothing. When I looked back at the floor, there was a single, long hair. Dark, not gray like mine. I bent down and picked it up. It was straight, fine, too long to be mine, too short to be from a brush. I didn't own anything like it. I folded it into a paper towel and placed it in the drawer with the bracelet. From that point on, I felt watched, not in the paranoid sense, not with fear, just awareness, like I was no longer alone in my space but sharing it with something just out of sight, something that moved with purpose. I installed a motion sensor in the hallway, one of those small battery-operated ones from the hardware store. I told myself it was for safety, an extra precaution, but really I wanted confirmation that I wasn't imagining things, that the walls weren't just shifting because of old age. It went off the first night. I was in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, when the faint red light blinked from the hallway. I got up, checked the spot. No one there. Nothing moved, but the light had changed. It had noticed something. I replaced the batteries, moved the sensor slightly. The next night, the same thing happened. Red blink, silence. I unplugged it and packed it away. One day, while organizing old boxes in the attic, I heard a thump from below. Not the kind a house makes. A deliberate, heavy thump, like someone dropping their heel. I paused, listening. Nothing followed. I went downstairs. Everything was in place, but the hallway mirror had a new smudge right at shoulder height, my shoulder. But I hadn't touched it that day. I began marking the corners of certain objects with a pencil, just a small dot. The corner of the dresser, the edge of the bookshelf, the leg of the coffee table. Each morning, I checked to see if anything had shifted, and sometimes it had. By a hair's breadth, but enough. I didn't call anyone. What would I say? That my walls were tapping out secrets? That the silence wasn't silent anymore? I didn't want to be the old man who cried wolf and ended up in a home. I wanted to understand it myself. So I waited, and listened, and documented, because the noise in the walls was growing, not louder, but bolder. It had patterns now, a rhythm, a confidence. It was no longer hiding, and neither was I. I had lived in that house for most of my life, long enough to know the quirks of every door hinge and the history behind every scratch on the floorboards. The second bedroom at the end of the hallway had once belonged to Jason before he left for college. After that, it became Margaret's sewing room for a while, then a guest room, then a place where I stored things I couldn't throw away but didn't want to see every day. The kind of room that quietly gathered time. I hadn't gone in there for a while, not since the last time Jason visited months ago, but that morning, something tugged at me. A strange sense that something had changed. I opened the door and stood at the threshold, breathing in the stale air of undisturbed corners. Dust shimmered in the sunlight that cut through the faded floral curtains. It looked the same at first, but it didn't feel the same. I stepped in carefully, as if not to disturb something asleep. The room was quiet, too quiet. No creaks, no tick of the old wall clock, no hum from the vent. Just stillness. I walked over to the dresser in the far corner. It was an old oak piece Margaret had found at a yard sale decades ago. Heavy, 3 drawers, carved handles shaped like leaves. I had always thought of it as one of the more solid things in the house. Imposing, sturdy, reliable. I opened the top drawer. Hand towels, extra pillowcases, a box of sewing needles still in its packaging. I opened the second drawer. Old birthday cards, spare light bulbs, a flashlight with corroded batteries. Then the third drawer. That's when I noticed it didn't pull all the way out. It stuck about 3/4 of the way. I tried again, gently, then harder. It budged slightly, then stopped. I knelt down to inspect it. The tracks were clean, no warping. I reached behind it with my fingers and felt resistance, not from the frame, but from something else. A lip, a panel. I pressed against it and felt it give just slightly. A hollow space. I stood up and looked around the room, as if someone might be watching. I knew no one was there, but I felt watched anyway. I returned to the drawer, gripped the edges, and pulled with both hands. It didn't come free, but it shifted enough for me to reach farther in. My fingers touched something cold. A box. It was small and metallic, with a clasp on the front. I pulled it out and set it on the dresser. My hands were trembling, though not from age, from something else. I opened it. Inside were several items wrapped in a faded handkerchief. I unwrapped them slowly. The first was a gold chain, fine, delicate, unlike anything Margaret had owned. Then a tube of lipstick, dusty, but untouched, a shade I'd never seen before. At the bottom of the box was a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it with care. It was a receipt, dated only 3 months earlier, a purchase from a boutique I didn't recognize. The name on the top was not mine, not Jason's, but I recognized the handwriting in the margin. A note had been scribbled. For upstairs. Keep quiet. Nothing more. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But the fact that it existed, hidden away in a space I never knew was there, was enough to unsettle me. I put everything back into the box and set it in the drawer again. I closed it, but not completely. I wanted to remember that it had once been open. I spent the rest of the day cleaning that room with a kind of quiet intensity. I dusted behind furniture, checked under the bed, even pulled back the old rug to look for loose boards. Everything seemed normal. Everything looked unchanged. But I no longer believed that what I saw was what truly existed. That room had another layer, a second skin. It had been used for something I hadn't authorized. That night, I dreamed of that drawer. Not the items inside, but the sensation of pulling it open, over and over, as if it were trying to tell me something I couldn't quite hear. I woke up cold, the blanket on the floor, the window open a crack. I never left it open. The next morning I checked the drawer again. The box was still there, but one of the items, the lipstick, was gone. I stood motionless for a long time, staring into the empty space it had occupied. My first instinct was to question myself. Had I misplaced it? Had I only imagined it? But I remembered the way it had felt in my hand, the faded label, the dried smear along the cap. It had been real. Now it wasn't. I didn't tell Jason. I didn't ask him about the drawer or the box or the missing item. I knew I wouldn't get a straight answer, and even if I did, I no longer trusted that words meant what they used to. Instead, I began walking the house differently, slower, listening as I moved, watching corners. I started to sense where the air shifted, which floorboards groaned when no one stepped on them, which doors creaked not from use, but from memory. The house had secrets. I had known that in theory. Now I felt it in my bones. I returned to the guest room often after that. I didn't touch the drawer again. I let it sit, slightly ajar, like a mouth about to speak. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I thought I heard it creak open just a bit more, not with weight or pressure, but with intention. The walls in that room were thicker than I remembered, the air denser. The light always fell a little different through the curtains, casting long shadows that didn't quite match the shape of the furniture. I stopped drawing them back. I let the shadows stay. They seemed to know more than I did. I began calling it the room with a double bottom in my mind. Not out loud, never out loud, just in passing thoughts, because that's what it was now, a place with layers, with depths that didn't show themselves unless they wanted to. A room that held other lives, other truths, and I had only just begun to peel them back. I noticed it in the early morning light, just as the sun pushed through the bedroom blinds and painted slanted bars across the floor. At first I thought it was a shadow or a trick of the light, but as I moved around the room, the shape stayed in place. A small gray sphere nestled between the legs of the nightstand and the wall, round, compact, and out of place. It was a ball of dust, not the kind that forms naturally in corners over time, not the soft scatter of lint that floats under furniture. This was deliberate, tightly formed, compressed, like it had been rolled between fingers. It didn't belong there. I bent down slowly, my knees protesting with a familiar stiffness, and picked it up with the tips of my fingers. It weighed nothing, but it felt dense, coherent, as if it had been made rather than formed. I held it in my palm for a long moment, turning it over, examining the way the gray fibers clung to each other. There were strands of hair in it, short, light brown, and a few almost translucent threads I couldn't place. Not mine. I hadn't seen hair like that in years. I stood up and placed the ball on top of the dresser, next to the glass jar I used for loose change. It sat there like an accusation. I didn't touch it again for the rest of the day, but I felt it in the room. It was too intentional, too strange. That day, I vacuumed the entire house, not out of cleanliness, but to reclaim something. The act of it gave me a sense of control. The movement, the noise, the weight of the machine dragging behind me, it all felt necessary. I paid extra attention to the bedroom, going over the floor 3 times. I even used the hose to clean around the baseboards. By the time I was done, I was sweating. My back ached, and my legs were sore. But the room felt sterile again, or at least it looked like it did. The next morning, the ball was gone. I hadn't thrown it away. I hadn't touched it. I checked the trash, the vacuum bag, the floor under the dresser. Nothing. It had vanished. I tried to dismiss it, told myself I must have knocked it over by accident. Maybe it had fallen behind something, but deep down, I knew better. Nothing in that house ever moved without leaving a trace, and this left none. That day I took out my notebook and drew a circle, a simple hand-drawn shape in the middle of the page. Beneath it I wrote, "Dust, but not dust." Then I closed the book and sat in the armchair in the corner of the room. I watched the space beside the dresser for hours, waiting for something to return, but the floor remained bare. Over the next few days, I found more of them. One appeared near the base of the hallway door. Another showed up on the second step of the staircase. Each one the same size, same density, same quiet presence. I started collecting them in a shallow dish on the kitchen counter next to the bread box. By the end of the week, there were 6. I showed them to no one. Jason called one afternoon to ask about a package. He said Emily had something shipped to the house by mistake. I hadn't seen anything, and I told him as much. He seemed irritated, said it should have arrived by now. I didn't mention the dust. How could I? What words would I even use? I began to develop a routine. Each morning I would walk through the house and check for new ones. Sometimes there were none. Sometimes I'd find one in a place I had already cleaned the day before, on a windowsill, beneath a chair, once even on the edge of the bathtub. I never heard them fall, never saw them appear. They simply arrived. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom, not out of fear, but because I wanted to know when it happened. I began sleeping on the living room couch with the hallway light on, and the door to the bedroom cracked open just enough to see the outline of the bed. I kept the house silent. No TV, no music. I listened. One night around 2 a.m. I heard a sound, a light thump, like something soft falling onto hardwood. I didn't move. I held my breath and stared at the open doorway. Nothing passed through it. No figure, no shadow. But I knew the sound. In the morning, I found another ball of dust, this time in the exact center of the bed I hadn't slept in. It was getting bolder. I took the dust dish and emptied it into a mason jar, sealed the lid tight, and stored it in the freezer. I didn't know why. It just felt safer there, like preserving a specimen, like freezing time. I labeled it with a piece of masking tape. October. The feeling in the house began to shift. It wasn't just the dust. The air changed. It carried a different weight. I could feel it when I walked through the hallway, when I stood still in the kitchen, like the space around me had become thicker, like I was moving through water. Even the mirrors started to reflect differently. One day, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror and didn't recognize the angle. My body looked turned when it wasn't. My arms seemed shorter, my head lower. I blinked, looked again, and it was fine. But the afterimage lingered. I began to think about the dust as messages, not just refuse, but signals, quiet reminders that I was not the only one moving through these rooms, that something, or someone, was cataloging me just as I had begun to catalog it. One morning, I opened the freezer to check the jar. The dust balls inside had collapsed. No longer round, they had flattened into pale gray sludge, their shape broken, their mass gone. The tape label had curled at the corners. I resealed the jar and placed it back. I didn't know what it meant, only that it unsettled me in a way that words couldn't reach. The next day, there were no new ones, nor the day after. But 3 days later, I woke up to find all 6 of them back on the dresser, reformed, identical, resting in a perfect line. And that was when I stopped trying to clean. There was a mirror on the wall by the stairs that had been there for as long as I could remember. It wasn't anything fancy, just an oval-shaped thing with a wooden frame painted white, now yellowing with age. Margaret had hung it there during our 2nd year in the house. She said the light from the front windows hit it in a way that made the stairwell look bigger. I never paid it much mind. It was just there, part of the house like the railings or the thermostat. I walked past it every day, sometimes without even noticing it. It became part of the rhythm of the house, a silent witness to decades of movement. Upstairs for laundry, downstairs for morning coffee, late-night trips to the kitchen when sleep wouldn't come. The mirror always reflected the same, the curve of the stairs behind me, the narrow wall leading to the living room, the sliver of ceiling light depending on the hour. It was a fixture, a background detail. That changed one Thursday morning. I had just come back inside from collecting the newspaper. The wind had been sharp, the kind that made your knuckles ache before you got to the mailbox. I stomped the cold off my shoes and started up the stairs, one hand gripping the railing, the other clutching the rolled-up paper. I turned the corner to the 2nd step when something caught in my peripheral vision. A flicker, a movement in the mirror. I stopped. I turned my head slowly. The mirror showed the same thing it always did: the hallway, the bottom of the stairs, and me. But there was something different in the way I looked. I leaned closer. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The outline was the same. The clothes, the posture. But my face looked like it belonged to someone thinking something I hadn't thought. My expression wasn't mine. I stood there for a full minute, studying myself. The me in the mirror wasn't doing anything unusual. He blinked when I blinked, tilted his head when I did. But there was something in the eyes, a kind of waiting, a kind of knowing. I raised a hand slowly and watched the reflection do the same, but it was the hesitation that unsettled me. There was a delay, not long, not enough for someone else to see. But I felt it. I took a step back and then forward again, like checking the frame rate of a video. The reflection followed, but I felt like it resented having to. Later that day, I stood at the base of the stairs and looked at the mirror again, this time in daylight. The morning light hit it just right, making the edges glow slightly. The reflection looked normal, everything in place. I stepped closer and saw the dust on the frame, the small crack near the bottom I'd forgotten about. But I couldn't unsee what I'd felt earlier. So I reached out and touched the glass. It was warm, not just room temperature warm, human warm, like the mirror had been touched recently from the other side. I pulled my hand back, wiped my fingers on my pants, and walked away without looking at it again. I didn't want to catch another glimpse of that almost version of myself. but for the rest of the day, I felt like something was watching the back of my head. That night, I avoided the stairs. I stayed downstairs and read until I couldn't keep my eyes open. When I finally made my way up to bed, I kept my gaze fixed on the steps, counting them as I went. I refused to look into the mirror, but I felt it looking at me, not through the surface, but around it, like a fog curling behind a wall. The next morning, I found the mirror tilted. Not by much, just a slight angle, maybe 2 degrees off what it had been the day before. Enough to change the reflection. Now, instead of showing the base of the stairs and part of the hallway, it captured more of the landing, including the door to the spare bedroom. I hadn't moved it. No one else had been in the house. I reached up and tried to straighten it. The screw on the left side was looser than it should have been. I tightened it, leveled the mirror again, and stepped back. The reflection was back to normal, but the light didn't look the same. The tone was off, warmer, like the air on the other side of the glass had its own season. I went back down and made coffee, trying to forget it. But the whole day, I found myself returning to that part of the house, standing on the stairs, watching the mirror out of the corner of my eye. The more I stared at it, the more I noticed the slight imperfections, the way the light shifted unevenly across the surface, the faint smudge near the center that didn't wipe away. That night, I set a small ceramic cup on the step just behind me, just out of direct sight from the mirror, but within the range of the reflection. I wanted to see if it would still be there in the morning. When I woke, the cup was gone. I searched the stairs, the landing, even the space under the rail where things sometimes fell. Nothing. I checked the kitchen, the living room, every table, every shelf. No cup. It wasn't valuable, just something I'd picked up at a flea market years ago, but its absence felt loaded, intentional. That evening, I walked past the mirror and paused again. My reflection stared back. Same clothes, same face. But now it looked like he was smiling. Not a wide grin, just a curl at the corner of the mouth. The kind of smile someone wears when they know something you don't. I stepped closer. The smile was gone. I raised my hand again and waved slowly. The reflection followed perfectly this time. No delay. No resistance. I leaned in until my breath fogged the glass. Then I whispered something. Nothing in particular. Just a sound. My reflection's mouth stayed closed. I took the mirror off the wall that night. I didn't break it. I didn't throw it out. I carried it down to the basement and leaned it against the wall behind the furnace. I covered it with an old sheet. Then I went back upstairs and avoided the stairwell wall completely, pretending there had never been anything hanging there. But the next day, when I came down for breakfast, the mirror was back on the wall, not perfectly aligned, slightly higher than before. The nails didn't match the original holes, but it hung there as if it had never been moved. I didn't touch it again. From then on, I kept my head down on the stairs. I stopped glancing sideways. I ignored the sliver of light that danced across the glass every afternoon. I didn't want to know if the reflection was still mine, because I was no longer sure it ever had been. There was a baby monitor tucked into the back of the hall closet. I hadn't seen it in years. It must have been left from when Jason brought the twins to visit one summer, back when they were small enough to need watching as they napped. The device had yellowed with age, the plastic casing brittle around the edges. I found it while rummaging through a pile of old electronics, looking for a spare extension cord. Something made me pull it out and set it on the hallway table. I didn't know why. It wasn't plugged in. It had no batteries, but it felt heavy in my hand, like a memory I hadn't fully processed. I left it there and forgot about it until the following night. I had just turned off the lights and settled into the armchair in the living room. I had started sleeping downstairs more often. I told myself it was the stairs, my knees, the cold drafts upstairs. But really, it was about proximity. I wanted to be closer to the front door, closer to an exit. The house was quiet. I had unplugged everything unnecessary. The fridge hummed in the kitchen. The furnace hadn't kicked on yet. The stillness had become a sort of companion. But then I heard it. A faint crackle, a soft hiss, like static whispering through cloth. I sat up slowly and listened. The sound was coming from the hallway. When I walked to the table, I saw the baby monitor was on. The tiny green LED was glowing, pulsing slightly. There were no batteries in it. I had checked. I had even opened the compartment and left it ajar, the cover bent back like a loose tooth. But it was on. The speaker let out a soft burst of static again. Then nothing. I leaned closer, holding my breath. The house didn't move. The air felt denser around me, thicker with the weight of something just beyond understanding. Then, very clearly, I heard my name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. It was a whisper, but not in a hushed or frightened way. It was deliberate, slow, someone speaking directly into the microphone on the other side. Walter. It wasn't Jason's voice. It wasn't Margaret's voice, long gone now from memory and anything more than photographs and fading home videos. This was something else. Neutral, genderless, stripped of identity like the voice on an old answering machine. I stepped back. My hands went cold. I stared at the device. It stayed on, silent now, the LED steady. I picked it up. It was warm to the touch. Not room temperature. Warm. I carried it to the kitchen and placed it on the counter. I unplugged the microwave and the coffee machine just to make sure no ambient interference could be blamed. I searched the house. Bedrooms, closets, basement. No other monitors. No transmitters. No phones left open on speaker. Nothing. The next night, it happened again. This time, it started with a low hum, a tone, like the beginning of a signal. Then the crackle. Then silence. Then my name again, Walter. Slightly slower, slightly clearer, as if the voice was learning how to say it better. The pitch hadn't changed, but there was something in the cadence that had shifted. It sounded more confident. I recorded it. I had an old cassette tape recorder I used for dictation in my work years ago. I hooked it up to a small microphone and placed it next to the speaker. I let it run for hours while I sat nearby, pretending to read. At 2:41 a.m., it spoke again. The tape captured it. I played it back. The static. The hum. The voice. I played it over and over, trying to catch something new. A syllable. A breath. Anything. But it always ended the same way. Just my name. I considered throwing the thing away, taking it out back and smashing it open with a hammer. But something held me back. I wanted to understand it. I needed to. I had lived my entire life cataloging things. Numbers, files, patterns. And now this thing was speaking my name, and I had no formula to decode it. On the fourth night, it changed. The static came first, then the voice. Walter, he's not listening. I froze. The voice didn't repeat. It fell silent. I stared at the speaker until my eyes burned. Who wasn't listening? Jason? Was this a warning? A message? A trick? I replayed the tape. It was there. Crisp. The words weren't distorted. They were real. The next day, I didn't leave the house. I sat by the window and watched the front walk. I checked the locks twice an hour. I called Jason, asked him if he had visited, if he had touched anything in the house. He brushed it off, said I was being paranoid, said maybe I was just hearing things. Maybe the device had picked up a neighbor's radio. I didn't mention the lack of batteries. The baby monitor stayed silent for 2 nights. I stopped sleeping. I sat at the kitchen table with the recorder running and the speaker in front of me, staring at it like it might confess. On the 7th night, it spoke again. The words came slowly, one by one. Walter, don't let her. The voice cut off. Static flooded the speaker, a sharp hiss that filled the kitchen like smoke. Then silence. I rewound the tape, played it back. The message stopped in the same place every time. Don't let her what? I didn't know who she was. Or maybe I did, and I didn't want to admit it. The word settled in my chest like a stone. That night, I placed the monitor in a metal box, wrapped it in foil, and buried it in the backyard beneath the old swing set. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't mark the spot. I just covered it with earth and leaves and walked away. I thought it would end. But 2 days later, a new one appeared. On the hallway table. Identical. Same make, same scratches, same yellowing plastic, batteries removed, power light glowing. And that night, the voice returned. It didn't say my name. It said hers. I found the box in the attic on a day when the sky outside hung low and heavy, the kind of gray that felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. I hadn't planned to go up there. I rarely did. The attic was Margaret's territory once. Her bins of decorations, fabric swatches, stacks of neatly labeled cardboard boxes arranged like sentries around the low rafters. After she passed, I left it all alone. Let it gather dust and silence. But something that morning had nudged me upward. Maybe it was the weight in the air, or the voice I thought I heard the night before. Maybe it was the way the house creaked more than usual. I wanted to be somewhere above it all, somewhere the ceilings couldn't press down. So I climbed the narrow stairs, flashlight in hand, ducked beneath the beam near the top, and stepped into the attic. It smelled the same. Dry wood, cardboard, time. I moved slowly, brushing cobwebs with the back of my wrist, careful not to step through the insulation between the beams. I ran the light across the boxes, reading Margaret's handwriting in faded Sharpie. XMS lights, baby clothes, Jason, blankets, good. The labels were comforting. I recognized them all, until I saw one that wasn't hers. It sat on its own at the far end of the attic, not dusty like the others, but newer somehow. The cardboard still held its shape. No label, no tape, just a dull brown box, sealed neatly, as though it had been placed there recently. I didn't remember putting it there. I hadn't been up in months, maybe longer. I would have noticed it. I knelt beside it and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in layers of old tissue paper, were 3 black film reels. Actual 8mm reels, the kind we used decades ago before home video became digital. I hadn't used a projector in years, but I still had one tucked into a cabinet downstairs. I recognized the reels instantly. Same size, same weight, same brittle plastic hubs. None of the reels were labeled. I didn't open the other boxes. I didn't look around the attic again. I took the reel on top, closed the lid, and walked back down slowly, gripping the film like a relic I'd unearthed from beneath something sacred. The projector was in the den. I hadn't touched it in at least 10 years. I dusted it off, replaced the bulb with the spare I'd miraculously kept in a drawer, and unspooled the beginning of the film. I fed the leader through the rollers, looped it into the take-up reel, and turned the machine on. The hum of the motor felt like a sound from another world. The film flickered to life on the wall. At first it was nothing, just static, dust particles dancing like snowflakes in the beam of light. Then a room came into view. My room. The camera was stationary, set up in the far corner near the closet, angled toward the bed. The image was grainy but clear enough. I saw the frame of the bed, the familiar drapes on the windows, the edge of the nightstand. It was my bedroom as it looked now, not how it used to be. This was recent. And then I saw her. A figure entered the room. A woman. She moved slowly, confidently. Her face never turned fully toward the camera, but the shape of her body, the length of her hair, the posture. I knew it. even in black and white. She wore a long shirt, almost like a nightgown, and her bare feet moved soundlessly across the wooden floor. She walked to my dresser, opened the top drawer, removed something, held it up, studied it, then placed it back, and moved to the bed. She sat on the edge. The film had no sound, but I could feel the tension in her shoulders. She turned her head slightly toward the door, and then lay back, one arm behind her head, the other resting on her stomach. She stayed like that for minutes, unmoving. Then she stood, walked out of frame, and the room was empty again. I stopped the projector. The reel kept spinning for a few seconds before the motor wound down and the room returned to silence. I stared at the wall. My mind turned over the details like numbers in a ledger. Who had set up the camera? Why? How had the film ended up in my attic? I didn't recognize the angle it was filmed from. There was no surface in the corner that could have held a camera at that height. It was eye level, maybe chest level, steady, as if on a tripod. But I hadn't owned a tripod in years. I rewound the reel and played it again. This time, I watched closely, frame by frame, when she moved. Her hands were deliberate. Her fingers touched each object like she was remembering it, not discovering it. The way she lingered at the drawer, the way she smoothed the bedspread, it was not random. It was a ritual. I noted the time of day by the light in the windows. Afternoon. Shadows casting east. That meant it had to have been filmed recently, within the last season, maybe the last month. I played the rest of the reel, 10 minutes of footage. After she left, the room remained empty. But I watched until the end, hoping for something else. A clue, a frame out of place. The film ended with a flash, an overexposure, and then went blank. I sat in the den for hours after that, the projector still humming faintly as the lamp cooled. I didn't move. I didn't rewind the film. I left it threaded and untouched, as if removing it might erase what I'd seen. That night, I searched the attic again. The other 2 reels were still in the box. I didn't open them. I couldn't. Not yet. I wrapped the box in an old towel and brought it down with me, storing it in the locked cabinet where I kept important documents. The lock hadn't turned in years, but it clicked shut with surprising ease. I checked the bedroom next, measured the walls, looked for screw holes, searched for any indication that something had been mounted there. I found nothing. The next morning, I opened the drawer the woman had touched in the film. Inside was a single earring. I had never seen it before. It wasn't Margaret's. It wasn't mine. It was a small stud with a sapphire stone set in a thin gold prong, clean, shiny, as if placed there recently. I closed the drawer and stood still, my hand resting on the edge of the wood, my body locked in place. The house felt different now, not darker, not colder, just aware. I began to check the books. It started without intention. I was dusting the shelves in the living room, something I hadn't done properly in weeks, maybe months. My hands moved across the old hardbacks like I was touching old friends, wiping the edges of spines I hadn't read in years. Each one held a place in time, volumes of law, tax code updates from a decade ago, novels Margaret used to love, poetry I pretended to understand. When I pulled down an old edition of Leaves of Grass, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It was yellowed, folded in thirds, and thin, almost translucent from age or handling. At first I thought it was a receipt or an old grocery list, but when I opened it, I froze. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was a woman's script, careful and slanted, the kind of writing taught in school when cursive was still a thing of pride. The ink was faded, but legible. He still doesn't know. Keep quiet until it's done. No name, no date, no context. I stood there for a long time, paper in hand, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. I stared at the shelf, trying to remember the last time I touched that book. Had it been there all this time? Years? Or had it been placed recently? It didn't make sense. Nothing about it did. I turned the note over, blank on the other side. No watermarks, no stationer's imprint, nothing that gave it away. I smelled it. No scent. Folded it again, carefully, along the same creases, and slid it into the inside pocket of my sweater. I pulled down every book on the shelf after that, one by one, methodically. I searched through each one, shaking them slightly, flipping pages, peering between the covers and the spine. I found 3 more notes. The second was in a paperback novel Margaret had read every summer, a detective story. Nothing serious. The note was torn along the top edge, as if ripped from a journal. The handwriting was the same. Put it where he won't look, near the end table. The third was wedged inside a church bulletin from 2003, stuck in a devotional collection I hadn't opened in 20 years. All these little intrusions, not violent, not explosive, just enough to bend reality until it cracked. Now, these notes. I made copies of them on my old printer, just in case. I stored the originals in a manila envelope and slipped it beneath the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in the den, in a hollow space I had carved out years ago for birth certificates and savings bonds. That night, I pulled out my old briefcase from the closet, the one I hadn't used since I retired. Inside was a stack of blank legal pads, a calculator, a dried-out pen. I took one of the pads and started a new record. I gave each note a heading: description, location found, possible connections. I drew diagrams of the house, plotted where each note had been discovered, and added dots where strange things had occurred. The picture that formed was not random. Most of the disturbances had clustered on the west side of the house: my bedroom, the staircase, the spare room, the hallway. The notes seemed to orbit that space. It was like watching ink soak into paper, spreading in rings from a single spill. I began pulling open drawers I hadn't touched in years: the sewing cabinet in the hallway, the sideboard in the dining room, the bottom drawer of the hall table that always stuck when it rained. In the back of that drawer, taped to the underside of the interior frame, was another note. It read, "He moved the mirror. Try again when he sleeps." I dropped the note as if it had burned me. There was no longer any doubt. Someone had been in my home. Not just once, not just recently. Over time, repeatedly. Someone who knew my habits, my objects, my blind spots. Someone who communicated with another person using these fragments, these pieces of breath written in ink. It wasn't just intrusion, it was coordination. I rechecked every lock in the house that night. I pushed a chair under the doorknob in the bedroom. I slept with the light on, the envelope of notes tucked under my pillow. The next morning, I found a fresh note in the mailbox. It wasn't sealed. No envelope, just folded once and slipped between the grocery coupons and the water bill. Almost finished. Wait for the signal. The handwriting was the same, but this one was signed, just a single initial. I had always been meticulous with my finances. Even after retirement, I kept track of every withdrawal, every purchase, every automatic payment. Numbers had been my language for most of my life. Neat, absolute, without room for lies. I kept ledgers long after most people switched to spreadsheets. I trusted paper. I trusted ink. I didn't trust convenience. It was a Friday morning when I noticed the discrepancy. I had received the monthly paper statement for my checking account, something I specifically requested even though the bank nudged me toward paperless every other week. I sat at the kitchen table with my glasses on the tip of my nose, cross-referencing the transactions line by line with the notebook I kept in the drawer beside the sink. I always wrote down when and where I spent money, even if it was just for a gallon of milk or a stamp. It started with a charge from a grocery store I hadn't stepped foot in for years. It was across town, in a neighborhood I had no reason to visit. The amount was small, $32 and change, but it stood out. I never spent without recording. I circled the line. 3 entries down, another transaction. A hardware store I didn't recognize. $17 listed as a cash register purchase. Again, not mine. I circled that one too. Then a charge from a gas station. $46. I hadn't driven more than 10 miles in weeks. My tank was still 3/4 full. I put down the pen and reread the statement from the top. 12 charges total that I couldn't account for. I checked the dates. All of them were recent, within the last 20 days. None of them large. Nothing extravagant. But they added up. $218 gone like smoke, and I had no idea where it had gone, or how. I called the bank. They verified my identity, asked me a list of security questions I answered without pause. They confirmed the charges had been made with my debit card, not a duplicate, not online. Physical use. PIN entered. I thanked them and hung up. Then I sat there in the silence of my own kitchen, staring at the cordless phone like it might confess something. I had my card. It was in my wallet. It hadn't left my sight, but someone had used it. I checked the transaction times. A few of them occurred while I was home, watching television, sleeping, cooking. That narrowed the possibilities. Someone had access. Someone close. I thought of Jason. Then I thought of her, Emily. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to believe that whatever was happening had a rational explanation, that the bank had made a mistake, that the charges were clerical errors, but the weight in my chest told me otherwise. I opened the drawer beneath the phone and pulled out my stack of past statements. I went back 4 months, August, July, June. The first signs were there, faint. A transaction here, another there. Small amounts I had once chalked up to my own forgetfulness. Coffee shops I didn't remember. Online bookstores I never used. Nothing suspicious on its own. But now, with fresh eyes, it looked like the beginning of a pattern. Each month, more charges, more frequent, more daring. I found my checkbook and flipped through the stubs. Check Subra 4527, blank. No memo line. Torn from the book with more force than usual. I checked my scanned copies. It had been cashed for $600. Payee, unreadable. The handwriting wasn't mine. I retrieved the lockbox from the back of the hall closet. Inside were my old account access forms, backup cards, social security documents. I kept everything in order. Or I thought I had. 2 of the spare checks were missing. I never noticed. I never looked. The feeling that settled in my bones then was not fear. It was something colder, a kind of stillness that came from betrayal. I didn't know who yet, but I knew why. I had resources. I had a house. I had something someone wanted, and they thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I was too old, too tired, too far gone to track pennies and dimes. They thought I would shrug at missing dollars like a man misplacing his glasses. They were wrong. I pulled out my old calculator and started adding the charges. 4 months, over $2,000, all under the radar, all just beneath the threshold of alarm, the kind of theft that grows like mold, quiet and slow, feeding on neglect. That night, I changed every password I had. I canceled the card and requested a new one. I called the bank again and asked for surveillance footage from the ATM withdrawals. They said they'd review it and get back to me. Then I sat in the den and stared at the empty fireplace, the flickering shadows cast by the lamplight, and thought about how many quiet ways there were to be erased. Not suddenly, not with violence, but with subtraction. Every dollar gone was a piece of me taken. Every forged signature a step closer to vanishing. The next day, I found another note. This one wasn't hidden. It was placed on the kitchen table, folded neatly beside my morning newspaper. The handwriting was the same as the others. "Try not to worry. It's almost over." No signature this time, just those 6 words. I didn't eat that day. I didn't speak. I went into the garage and opened the small safe I had hidden behind the tool bench. Inside was a stack of cash. Not much, just enough. Still there, untouched. It was the only thing in the house I trusted now. I found it on the nightstand. I hadn't seen it in weeks, not since I sealed it in a plastic bag and buried it in the back of my drawer beneath old tax records and expired warranties. I had nearly convinced myself I had imagined the entire thing, that maybe it had been Margaret's after all, a forgotten relic, misplaced during a move, a cleaning, a memory too distant to trace. But it was there again, in plain sight, lying directly in the center of the polished wood surface, not dropped, not carelessly placed, centered, aligned, like someone had measured the distance from each edge and set it there with intention. I stood over it for several minutes before moving. The light from the window caught the thin gold band and made it shimmer faintly, like something alive. It looked the same, delicate links, floral etching, the tiny clasp with a faint scratch across its hinge. But it wasn't the same. It felt heavier. It wasn't dusted or dulled. In fact, it looked cleaner than when I last saw it, as if someone had taken the time to polish it. I picked it up with 2 fingers, afraid to feel the warmth again, but it was cold this time. Cold and dry. A dead weight. I walked it slowly back to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and placed it on a paper towel. I stared at it while the kettle boiled, the whistle growing louder, sharper, until I had to stand up and turn it off. I returned and sat again. It hadn't moved. I unfolded a napkin and wrapped the bracelet inside, then slipped it into an envelope. I wrote nothing on the outside, didn't seal it, just placed it in the drawer next to the silverware and pushed it to the back. For the rest of the day, I tried to distract myself. I trimmed the hedges, raked the front yard, repainted the edges of the porch where the paint had chipped over the winter. My hands worked, but my mind looped the same question over and over. Who was putting it back? The question no longer felt hypothetical. Someone had been inside, not breaking in, not forced entry, but entering. Slipping in and out like they belonged, as if the house were theirs, and I was the intruder. That night, I locked the bedroom door for the first time in years. I pushed the desk chair under the knob and left the hallway light on. I slept in clothes, not out of fear exactly, but out of a readiness I hadn't felt since the war. When I woke, the chair was moved, not by much, an inch, maybe 2, but enough to know it had shifted. I had wedged it tight. It couldn't have slid on its own. The doorknob looked untouched, but the light in the hallway was off. I stepped out and walked to the kitchen. The envelope was on the table, unwrapped, empty. The bracelet was gone. No note this time, no message, just absence. I checked every door, every window, every lock. Nothing broken, nothing ajar. I looked for footprints, fingerprints, anything. The house was as it always was, calm, clean, still. But I knew what I had seen, what I had placed, what had vanished. I went to the basement. I dug through Margaret's old boxes until I found the one labeled storage glass. Inside were mason jars, mismatched lids, a few chipped saucers. I took one jar, rinsed it clean, and dried it twice. I left it on the counter. That evening, I didn't cook. I didn't read. I didn't turn on the television. I sat in the living room, lights off, the house silent. I waited. By midnight, I felt the shift. Not a noise, not a movement, just a pressure, like something had entered the space between thought and awareness. I rose quietly and walked to the kitchen. The bracelet was back, inside the jar, lid sealed, no dust, no condensation. just the gold circle curled at the bottom like it had been born there. I didn't open it. I didn't touch it. I labeled the lid with masking tape. Return to. I placed it on the shelf above the sink, between a cracked salt shaker and an old timer with a broken bell. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Not safe, not resolved, but calm. I spent the next day sorting through old receipts, account statements, boxes of photographs. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just needed to see the past with clearer eyes. I came across pictures of Jason as a boy, Margaret holding him up on her shoulder, his hand in hers. I didn't remember him ever buying her jewelry, not like that. But there was one photo, faded and poorly framed, of a much younger Jason, maybe 15, standing in front of the fireplace with a girl I didn't recognize. She wore a bracelet. It looked the same. I turned the photo over. No date, no name. I left it on the table. The next morning, it was gone, and the bracelet was back on my pillow. It was just after 7 in the morning when I noticed the silence. Not the usual kind that filled the house. The soft, aging silence of an old structure with old air. This silence had weight. It pressed down against my chest as I descended the stairs, each step creaking with a familiar groan. The kind of silence that felt curated, sculpted, unnatural, like something had left, but not before taking the atmosphere with it. I walked through the hallway first. The mirror was still on the wall, though it no longer reflected quite right. The angle was off again, despite my efforts to recenter it days before. I didn't stop. I moved past it as if walking too close might wake something. The living room was undisturbed. The throw blanket folded, the television remote where I always left it, the dent in the seat cushion still there from the night before. The kitchen, too, appeared untouched. But it was in the kitchen that I first felt it. The absence. The jar was gone. The one with the bracelet. I had placed it on the top shelf near the broken timer, labeled in my own handwriting, sealed tightly. I had checked it the night before going to sleep. Now the space was empty, the dust outline where the jar had rested like a ghost of glass. I opened the cabinets. Nothing. I checked the trash, the recycling bin, the sink. Gone. Not broken. Not misplaced. Taken. I sat at the table. My hands rested flat against the wood, the grain beneath my fingers a reminder that something still existed in its original form. My tea kettle hissed behind me, but I let it whistle into the walls. I was listening for something else. Movement, breath, the kind of soft intrusion I had grown familiar with. There was none. I walked to the front door and opened it. The morning was crisp, sky pale and blank. No cars passed. No dogs barked. The neighborhood was still asleep or pretending to be. The mailbox was empty. For once, no flyers, no bills, no folded notes without envelopes. I closed the door and checked the locks. All latched. The stairs creaked under my weight as I made my way to the spare room. It smelled like it always did, dust and old wood, but I could feel the difference. The air wasn't stale. It was disturbed, like someone had walked through recently. The impression of presence, but without a shadow. I moved to the dresser. Third drawer. I pulled it open slowly. The lining paper had been shifted. The small indentation in the center, where I once found that silver chain, was smooth now. Flattened. As if a hand had pressed down gently, erasing the memory of what had rested there. I checked the closet. The hangers were spaced too perfectly. No sway, no imbalance, just absence. On the floor beneath the coats, I found a single paper clip. It was bent into a near straight line. That was all. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. This had never been my room. Not really. Not even when Jason lived here. It had always belonged to someone else, even when unoccupied. That feeling was stronger now. Ownership had shifted. I spent the rest of the morning cataloging, not in my notebook, not on paper, in my mind. Each drawer, each shelf, each door opened and closed. I moved room to room, silently confirming the things that remained. The radio on the mantelpiece, the photograph of Margaret and me at the lake, the clock in the hallway, always 5 minutes behind. But small things were missing. The ashtray on the porch I hadn't used in 10 years, a blue pen I kept beside the rotary phone, the chipped saucer Margaret used for her rings, gone. Individually, they were meaningless. Together they formed a pattern, not a theft, a migration, as if the house was slowly being emptied without violence, as if each item was being called somewhere else. That night I went to bed without changing clothes. I turned off the lamp and waited in the dark. No creaks, no thumps, just stillness. When I woke the next morning, the house was colder. I checked the thermostat, unchanged, but the air carried something else, a hollowness, like the walls had receded a few inches during the night. I moved back through the house. The den was untouched. The bathroom mirror fogged from my breath and nothing else. In the kitchen, the window above the sink was unlocked. I never left it that way. I stood there for minutes, hand on the sill, waiting for a breeze to justify what I felt. There was none, just a curtain that refused to move. I found the envelope of notes later that afternoon. It had been in the filing cabinet. Now it sat on the coffee table, perfectly centered. The notes were gone, all except one. It read, "Time's up." No initials, no handwriting I recognized, just black typewriter font on thick paper. I burned it in the fireplace, watched the edges curl inward like leaves drying in reverse. Ash floated upward and disappeared before reaching the flue. That night, I didn't lock the doors. I left the front porch light off. I didn't sleep. And in the hour just before dawn, when the sky was too dark to call morning but too pale to be night, I heard the floorboard in the hallway shift. Just once. Not heavy. Not fast. Just enough to let me know. Someone had left. The house was quiet. Not in the way it had always been, but in a new way. Final. Like a courtroom after the verdict. The kind of silence that comes only after the last gavel falls, when everyone leaves their chairs, and there's nothing left to say. I had heard many kinds of silence over the years. Lonely silence, grieving silence, the empty quiet of a morning without a voice on the other side of the table. But this one was different. It was not waiting for anything. It had already decided. I moved through the rooms slowly that morning, not out of caution, but with the reverence one gives a place that has just buried something sacred. I didn't speak. I didn't turn on the radio or the lamp or the faucet. The air inside had the stillness of a held breath, as if the walls had chosen not to exhale. I stood in the hallway, looking at the mirror. It no longer showed anything unusual. No angle was off, no image delayed. Just an old man standing in a house that had run out of time. There were no more notes, no more voices. The drawer that never quite shut was now fully closed. The door to the spare room, always slightly ajar, stayed perfectly aligned with its frame. Even the dust seemed to have settled evenly again, as though the floors had no more secrets left to carry. I went to the kitchen and brewed a cup of coffee. There was no sugar left, no cream. I didn't bother with either. I sat at the table with the mug warming my hands and looked out the window. The world outside was in motion. A woman jogged by with her headphones in. A delivery truck pulled up across the street. A crow landed on the power line and watched me for a while, then flew off without a sound. It was only inside that everything had stopped. I pulled the envelope from the drawer. Not the one with the notes. That one was ash now. But another. A plain white envelope, sealed, addressed in my own handwriting. I had written it the day before. I placed it on the table, then opened my ledger and made one final entry. the name, the amount, the date. The note that followed was short, not angry, not bitter, just precise. Because that's what justice really is in the end. Not noise, not drama, but clarity. A sharp edge that doesn't cut skin, but history, a correction to the record. I went to the filing cabinet and removed the documents I had gathered, the copies of the bank statements, the surveillance request confirmations, the insurance policies, the notarized affidavits. I placed them in a folder and slid it under the envelope. Then I stood and opened the front door. The morning sun was dull, gray behind the clouds, but steady. I stepped outside, walked down the porch steps, and left the front door open behind me. I didn't lock it. I walked around the side of the house to the shed. Inside were the boxes I hadn't touched in years. I pulled out the one labeled Estate. Margaret had started it. I had finished it. It contained everything needed for the kind of exit no one talks about, but everyone thinks about eventually. I removed the power of attorney papers, the updated will, the instructions for the bank, the letter for Jason. He would read it. Eventually. He would understand. Not immediately, not easily, but he would understand. Because when the silence comes not from absence, but from design, it speaks louder than anything. I spent the rest of the day tidying. I dusted the bookshelves. I swept the porch. I packed a small suitcase with 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, and the photograph of Margaret on the lake, her hair pulled back, her eyes closed, the wind catching the corner of her smile. I left the suitcase by the back door. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I sat in the living room with the lamp off and the curtains drawn. And I waited. But nothing happened. No voice, no tapping, no shifted objects. The house had emptied itself, not just of them, of everything that didn't belong to me. And in that stillness, something settled in my chest. Not relief, not pride, just quiet. A reckoning, not for what was taken, but for what was restored. The next morning, I took the suitcase and walked to the car. I didn't look back at the house. There was no need. It no longer held anything that wasn't mine. And in the silence it left behind, I finally heard myself again.